Wilfred Owen is in many ways one of the great modernist poets of the English experience of World War One. Modernist in the sense that he is a transitional figure. He is not a high modernist of what is going on with Yeats and Pound and Eliot and those figures, but he is coming to conclusions and writing in an idiom that would be very familiar to the modernist poets. And he was a really interesting figure who has historical value for that. He was from a middle class family out of Western England near the Welsh border. He had some frustrated ambitions for higher education, often very limited for his economic circumstances. After he finished with his formal schooling, he spent about 2 years in France working as a tutor. And at the end of that, he enlisted in the British Army in September 1915, about a year after the war first started. So he was not part of an initial rush to get into the action and do all of that. He was perhaps, holding off on that. He was still a young guy, but he was prime age for military service. And notably, he was perhaps hesitant on that for whatever reason. But once he got in, it became obvious why maybe he was prudent to sit it out. The experience was quite brutal on him, and he experienced trench warfare that was just horrifying. And because of that, he spent some time in a hospital, Scotland, dealing with what was then titled shell shocks, or we might call it PTSD. Basically, he just had a mental and emotional breakdown from the horrifying experiences that he had in service. But it was at this hospital as well, ironically, that he met and befriended the poet Siegfried Sassoon, the much more established poet of wartime Britain, who was himself starting to really write some poetry that was critical of the war. He was very notably not only a war poet, but he's very specifically an anti-war poet. And Owen was conscripted into that genre. And through Sassoon, he was able to establish contacts with literary figures broadly, while Sassoon was upper crust and aristocratic and a little bit, not blasé, but filtered his condemnation and what he saw and what he experienced in the war, filtered it all through a kind of objectified distancing effect that had some socioeconomic overtones of class or sophistication. Owen did not really have any of that. He was more rough-edged. He was more working class, or middle class even, at least. And so his experience, his voice came out as much more vigorous, much more rough, and in some ways much more vital. He was not filtering his work through anything. It was a visceral experience of the horrors of war that he tried to capture. And he leaves us a slim body of work, but a very potent body of work before he was killed in action. He died in France fighting 1 week before the end of the war, before the armistice. It is a tragic loss. He was a very key figure, and the work that he leaves us has some great significance. And probably his most potent work is one called Dulce et Decorum Est, which is a quote from Horace. It turns The use of this quotation turns very ironic at the end, and we'll get to that in a second. Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs and toward our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshod. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas! Gas! Quick, boys! An ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime, dim though the misty panes and thick green as under a green sea. I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. Well, the that last line, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, that means sweet and proper it is to die for one's country, roughly. It is from Horace, from his odes, the Roman poet who adopted a kind of languid perspective on life's turbulations and mouthed at the same time a kind of official support for the imperial state. Okay, fine. That's Horace. He is a great poet, and what? And Horace, being a poet of the Roman Empire, being a poet of Latin, would have been very well known to anybody who was educated in Britain in the generations in which Wilfred Owen was. So they focus very heavily on Latin. They focus very heavily on the Roman poets particularly, and Horace was a favorite because he was nice and relatively short, and you can memorize big chunks of it and even recite it. So there's that. And obviously, the tenor of patriotism and spirit of sacrifice and the nobility of sacrifice coming at the end after this poem of horrific experience in actual war, where it is a visceral and ugly experience of, well, poison gas, mustard gas, and the horrifying, ugly death that results from that. Coming at the end of that, this encomium to patriotism and personal sacrifice for mother country or whatever, just sounds so hollow and jingoistic and pathetic. So it is. This poem is kind of like two works. There's everything that comes before those last two lines, and then there's those last two lines, or that last line. Everything in English is ugly and gruesome and heartbreaking and real. And everything in those last words is fake, is phony. Is, as the poem puts it, the old lie. The lie that it is sweet to die for your country, when really Owen understood that millions of people were dying ugly deaths for their respective countries. That the experience of war for their countries was still a brutal, dehumanizing meat grinder that meant nothing. And the savagery of the poem feeds on the savagery of saying that, yes, your deaths will mean something. The savagery of policymakers who launched the war, who run the war, who think, well, okay, we'll just throw some more human beings into that fire and see if we can put it out that way. And that ugliness, that truth cuts through all of the propaganda that other poets, that other artists, that other government propaganda efforts were trying to pump out. Poets like Rupert Brooke, who came earlier and was all rah rah, let's go enlist, let's die for our country, and if I shall die, my life will have meaning, and all of that, and it will claim the whatever foreign land I am buried in, that land will be claimed for the flag of Britain, and it is also stirring, but from Owen's perspective, it is meaningless. It is hollow. It is brutal, brutal falsity. He was taking in this, and this poem went through very different development stages. It was, I believe, written in 1918, but it wasn't published until 1920 after his death. It was originally written as a kind of rejoinder or attack on a popular jingoist poet named Jessie Pope, who was basically just, light verse, not very serious, not a great artist by any means, but she had been writing the kind of stuff like a watered down, hackneyed Rupert Brooke, trying to inspire people to keep fighting the war for what, it's an honest effort, and it is a real enemy and real geopolitical consequences all around. And I'm not casting aspersions on anything, but he saw that the work that she was doing was cancerous, and the work that she was doing was just inspiring all these people with these lies to go into battle and meet this buzzsaw of modern, mechanized, dehumanizing warfare. Just think about that horrible, horrible image of the mustard gas, the gas, quick boys in ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time, but someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or a lime. Notice that easy rhyme contrasted with the kind of a jumbling meter. The meter is chaos. The rhyme is remarkably solid throughout, and that the poetic form holds because of that, and it creates more tension in the poem, and that itself is more interesting as you read on. Dim through the misting panes and green and thick green light, as under a green sea, I saw him drowning. He is drowning because he cannot breathe, because he is breathing in gas. And that image of drowning is something very visceral, because mustard gas warfare was very new in the annals of warfare, and so people didn't necessarily know how to understand it. It's like, it's all kind of abstract. People just drop something and it smokes, and you got to put on a gas mask, and what are you doing? Here, Owen brings us into that experience. He shows us the perspective of a soldier who in a moment, in just a second, suddenly, oh my God, I got to get this on, and he's fumbling, and he's sort of like scared, and he's terrified, and this is just out of a minute ago he was probably perfectly comfortable, but in that minute he should have been scared at all times, and so that has some significance right there. But then in the actual minute, he is fumbling all over the place, and he is drowning. And the poet, the narrator, the poetic voice is watching that as someone drowning, which is something that many people can understand. They can envision, they can see in their mind's eye. When you say someone is drowning, you have an image of their face, perhaps really scrambling, and the terror as they're going down because they cannot breathe. Something that is supposed to be automatic, something that is supposed to be unthinking, something that is supposed to be just the easiest thing in the world to do, but suddenly you can't do it. And so that image guttering, choking, drowning, repeating that word has great, great power. And the poem itself works with that. The poem itself drives along that visceral, brutal line to make people look at this is the reality of war. This is what it is really like. So it is drawing from a kind of realist tradition instead of the romantic tradition of before realism, or even the polite Victorianism that superseded it. And it is driving towards a kind of visceral, broken experience of the war that the art can produce, but that you can't necessarily represent objectively. That gas, quick boys, is a visceral experience of the poetry itself, of the words, the language, the medium itself, and that mimics in form and content, mimics what it's actually about. So, excuse me, so the words on the page have an inordinate power on a representational level as well. And these are the things that are driving this poem and that make Owen's work particularly salient through the end of the war. He is writing it at the end of the war. It's not necessarily, this is published after the war, after his death. So this isn't necessarily dissuading anyone from joining up because the war was over. But it does lead to that tenor of the 1920s when they're really reevaluating what life is like in the 20th century and realizing, well, all those polite little euphemisms of civilization and polite people engaging in warfare and geopolitics and trying to do things in a very elevated and sophisticated terms. This is about the ugly brutality underneath all of that that we need to be aware of, and that the modernists would really dwell in and start to make much more of on a formal level. But for what it is, this is the great capstone at the end of the three most prominent figures in war poetry of the First World War, which is you got to start it with Rupert Brooke, and then Siegfried Sassoon, and then this figure, probably the most vibrant of them, Wilfred Owen.